Hi, everybody.
Good morning. Good morning.
How's everybody? Everybody awake? I am Kathy Fleming. I'm the Executive Director of the St. Augustine Lighthouse and Maritime Museum, and I'm going to be turning my own slides today, so we'll see how that works. Where are my Coast Guard folks in here? Hi, Coasties. I'm very privileged to have worked indirectly with the Coast Guard for 23 years, and 7 years of that time was as a leasee of the Coast Guard, where they ran part of the site and I ran the other part. And that has been fun and challenging, and I have learned so much, and I really appreciate the Coast Guard. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about that today. Let me just give you background information. This, of course, is the modern-day Coast Guard. I'm not going to talk a little bit about that, but I thought if I was going to talk about them, I ought to show you a few pictures of the wonderful operation from Mayport and the NAS Jax area. Just tremendous work that is being done today against the war on drugs and all kinds of wonderful things. This, of course, is the First Coast area. We heard a little bit about it in the last presentation. St. Johns County is right where St. Augustine is. That's where I'm from. It's kind of in the center. Are you guys all locals, or are you from around the United States? Locals for my local people. We're mostly local, okay. But some of you may want to be interested in what we're talking about when we talk about the First Coast. It is almost 19% water. St. Johns County, of course, is almost 26% water, and has had a maritime lifestyle and a lifestyle connected to the sea since the Timucuans were here in about the year 1000. Very, very connected to the sea still today. So offshore, the submerged lands and off St. Johns County and off this area are extraordinarily dynamic. We have a group of maritime archaeologists that work with us at the St. Augustine Lighthouse, and we know that, like, in a storm, sand can move as much as 8 feet. One of the reasons it's so dynamic is because you all know there's the Gulf Stream sweeping out toward Europe, which is why the Spanish liked it here. They wanted a foothold and founded St. Augustine during a battle with the French. That's a whole other talk that I give. But there's also this littoral current that's washing down closer to shore, and that's moving sand constantly. And so it's building up anytime there's a jetty or a groin or something like that, it's building up. And right at the lighthouse, it's one of the few places in the United States where it's not eroding in front of it. We're getting further from the sea as we go. And you'll see some of that as I go through the talk. So this is the lighthouse. It was run by the Coast Guard, or at least the beacon was run by the Coast Guard from 1939 through 2002. In 2002, the Coast Guard did cede the light itself and the tower to the museum as part of a new historic preservation law. I was also, I serve as a Florida Historical Commissioner, so I give out part of roughly $14 million a year to preservation grants. And in the last presentation we saw about the headquarters building, I was pleased to be able to give that some money last year, actually, for part of that restoration. So, and to score that application is a great opening. So this is what the Lightkeeper's house looked like when we first started restoring it. There were actually 16 women who did this feat, and a lot of people said, "Oh, little lady, you can't do that," and they did it anyway. It had been burned just almost to the ground and was almost destroyed. So we're really proud of it, that we've taken care of it. Of course, this is the mission of the United States Coast Guard. The thing that fascinates me about this is when I talk to people today, particularly young people. We serve about 47,000 school-aged children at the museum. And people come through, and we're always talking about the military history and what's happening, because the site and all lighthouses really have a military history. And you know, my dad was an Army tank mechanic in Korea, so it interests me very much, our nation and how we defend it. Nobody understands that the Coast Guard can serve any place but along the coast. Most people don't understand what lighthouses are for. One boy said to me, "Hey lady, when does that thing take off?" I said, not going to happen. So our mission is to discover and preserve and present and keep alive these stories of the oldest continually occupied port city in the United States, and really the oldest ports all the way from Amelia Island, where the French landed in 1562, down to Volusia County, and even down there to the Banana River, where my in-laws are from. My father-in-law was in World War II. He was on Kwajalein Island. This is a memorial bell from the United States Lighthouse Service that is on our property, and these are the volunteer members of the Chief Petty Officer's Mess from Section Jacksonville. They helped us restore this bell. It is a memorial to a Coast Guard crew who lost their lives in the war against drugs. And we're really proud to have it on the property. It has become a place where we leave memorials to people who are lost at sea or folks who've worked in the maritime industry all their lives, and this is what it looks like after restoration. It's right in front of the keeper's house. So if you ever get a chance to come down there and just walk up to it and spend some quiet moments, it's a nice memorial there. The St. Augustine Light was added to the National Register in 1980. And as I said, in 2002, it became a private aid to navigation. So it is the museum that keeps it shining today. We're still using 1,000-watt incandescent light bulbs. We have bought every incandescent light bulb we can find. And when it comes down to the time of it, we're probably going to have to switch over to something. That's going to be an interesting thing. So the present inlet is almost in the identical location of the first Spanish period. And of course, the Spanish were the first to really have ATON in the area. And another thing that I find interesting is that people are always really fascinated. When was it a lighthouse? When was it a lighthouse? And I always say to them, it doesn't really matter when it was a lighthouse. What really matters is when were aids to navigation developed? When did the port develop? When did people start to move ships in and out and build the economy and defend the shoreline in a real way? And the Spanish first did this. In 1569, we know as early as then, they were building these watchtowers, and there was a little hut that housed 6 soldiers or sailors. I don't know if they called them sailors in those days. They were called centinelas by the Spanish. And we know from the Spanish records at the Archivos in Spain that they kept a canoe. So if you wanted to do a warning, you jumped in the canoe and you paddled like heck to get to St. Augustine. I'm really glad that we don't have to do that system today. So the Raid of Sir Francis Drake is the first archival time we see the watchtower. And Francis Drake, an English privateer, of course, was raiding, and he had gone around the Caribbean, and he was having a crummy voyage. Wasn't getting very much loot at all. Queen Elizabeth wasn't going to be terribly happy with him. His crew was mutinying. He sees this place, he says, built like a beacon. Well, it's a Spanish watchtower. And the Spanish fort, the Castillo de San Marcos, of course, at that time is plastered white with a big old red stripe on it. And their idea is, this is going to scare everybody. This is going to be the power of Spain. Here it is. And Spain is the maritime power. I have a friend in Spain, in Malaga, who's a shipbuilder, and he said, the sea was not the sea until the Spanish made it oceanic. I always tell that to Navy people, and they always laugh. But that was very much like an aid to navigation for Sir Francis Drake, because he saw it and he showed up and he sacked the city and burned it to the ground and got all kinds of loot. In the British period, there's a lot more ships traffic. The British came into St. Augustine for only 20 years. They started in 1763. They rebuilt everything. They rebuilt the watchtower. They actually put wooden construction on top of it. And lots more ships traffic that came in. But down here at the bottom, you can see that there's 2 actual. One is kind of a faux entrance into the harbor. And I don't know if you can see this, let's leave my little laser pointer, but right there, this is 3 feet at low water, and this is 15. So you had to know, if you're coming in during that period, that you wanted to take this channel and not this one. Otherwise, you got stuck. And lots of people made a mistake and went the wrong way. And so this is from our archaeologists, and these are all shipwreck sites from that period of time, or potential shipwreck sites, where these people are trying to get into the channel and they pick the wrong one, or they run aground, or the sand had changed because of that littoral current. And this is actually a site from the end of the American Revolution. If you come down to the lighthouse and you visit us, you will see a shipwreck that we found from the evacuation of Charleston, just real briefly. It's a British ship. December 14th, 1782, the British evacuate Charleston, South Carolina. They're terrified of the Americans coming in. 2 weeks later, it's New Year's Eve. They're coming into British East Florida, whose capital was St. Augustine. The population swelled to the size of New York City in the day, so many people came in there. And that evening, there were as many as 16 ships that wrecked on the sandbar. We have found one of them, and we have the artifacts from it, and we conserve them there on site. We just opened a new maritime archaeology lab. So this is as much as I'm going to go into that, but I would love to have you guys come down and take a look. Please come and see us. We would love to have you, because it's a very interesting. These are cauldron. This is actually for cooking on the ship. This year we're working on a different shipwreck, and that shipwreck is a supply ship, so it's bringing in They had 28 cauldron on it. You wouldn't use 28 cauldron on a ship, maybe 12 at most. So it's bringing in things to sell to St. Augustine. So we don't know what time that one is yet, but it might be from the Second Spanish period. And I put this in because the governor Cespedes was very, very interested in improving St. Augustine and improving its economy. And so he also supported maritime trade. In 1787, there were 80 ships that arrived. In 1803, there were 61 ships. And you can see he's trading with America. 79% the first year were from U.S. ports. It just went back and forth. In 1806, there were only 42 ships, but 88% of them were from the United States. And it was during this period that Alexander Hamilton started the revenue cutters, or the revenue marine, which later became the Coast Guard. So it's interesting to note that young America is beginning to put its aids to navigation together and its coastal defense together. And of course, someone who had a real impact on lighthouses and aids to navigation was Benjamin Franklin. When he was the ambassador to France, he'd been in a shipwreck. And the only reason that they were saved was because they saw the light from the lighthouse and they figured out how to approach the shore. It was in a storm. He was saved. He came back to America and really promoted lighthouses. So it's one of the things that our founding fathers have there. So this goes on to talk a little bit about the legislative history of the Lighthouse Service. The act was in August 7th of 1789, the establishment of the United States Lighthouse Service. And they built their first lighthouse in New Jersey in 1792. That doesn't mean that there weren't other lighthouses standing. There was one in St. Augustine. There was one in Boston. These were colonial lighthouses. This is an official American first lighthouse that's built by the American government after it becomes a nation. Of course, in 1821, Florida became a U.S. territory. The very next year, there's this fellow named Augustine Fresnel. He's a young engineer in France. He's a sickly fellow, and he really wants to explore light. And so eventually he gets money to fund this new project, and he invents something called the Fresnel lens. Today, they're used on the deck of aircraft carriers for lights, in ophthalmology, all kinds of places that Fresnel lens technology. If you drive out of your driveway and you have one of those convex mirrors that, where you can see around the corner, that's Fresnel lens technology right there. All kinds of places that it's used today. Fresnel invents this, and he tests the first one on top of the Arc de Triomphe in Paris. I just think that's fascinating that you can do that, climb out on a monument and test a lens. They do such a good job in France, and it's glowing and it's brilliant, and the safety record of the ports in France really increase. And guess what's happening in America? There's this fella, his name is Pleasanton, Stephen Pleasanton. And he's a pretty good guy. He's saved the Declaration of Independence from a fire. He's not a bad guy, but he's a cheapskate. He's a big cheapskate. And he has a friendship with this guy named Winslow Lewis. And so he puts these lamps in, called argon lamps, in his lighthouses, and they're cheap to install, and he gives Lewis this contract. And so for the next 20 years, Pleasanton fights the people who know about Fresnel lenses and says, no, I'm not going to put this in there too much. They're too much to install. And so America really doesn't have a very good safety record compared to other ports. So it's not until really the 1920s, between 1920 and 1935, because of installation of Fresnel lenses right before the American Civil War and after it, because of radio beacon technology and other things, that America rises from 6th in safety in the world to 2nd in port safety in the world, behind only the Netherlands. And what kind of ports do the Netherlands have anyway? This is actually the first lighthouse in Florida. Maybe the first lighthouse in the United States. I believe the British lit it when they were here. I can't prove it yet. I keep looking. Anybody finds out, let me know. It was lit as an American lighthouse in May of 1824. It is the site of the first permanent aid to navigation in the New World. This is a picture of the current lighthouse taken from the top of the old one. Erosion started to claim it. And so with federal reconstruction money, $100,000, they come in and they build this new tower. It has about 1 million bricks in it. It has 6-foot thick brick walls at the bottom. And there it is in 1936, right before the Coast Guard took over. In 1939, in July, the Lighthouse Service was merged with the United States Coast Guard. And so that's when the Coast Guard began running the site. They ran it from Mayport. They come down in the big white truck and take care of it once a month. Of course, this is the same year that Hitler invaded Poland, as we just heard about in our last presentation. And what President Roosevelt did was he put the Coast Guard in with the Department of the Navy for the war. The Coast Guard at that time was training in Algiers, Louisiana. And it was very damp there. There's a lot of mold growing. If you've been through hurricanes locally, you know what mold is like. My house has flooded twice now the past couple of years. And so I know what mold is like too. They really wanted to move out of Louisiana into a better place. And so William Keenan, who was the president of the hotel and part of the Flagler family, offered him the Ponce de Leon Hotel in St. Augustine. And so they moved, with some help of some senators, to St. Augustine, Florida. And they began to train in this grand hotel in 1888. And there's all kinds of stories. I've done a lot of oral histories with survivors, with World War II veterans of the Coast Guard. I've read a lot of newspaper accounts. We have Herbert Hoover's files in the Lighthouse. And we talk about the things that happened around this hotel. Ponce was like this big, scary ghost hotel. They said when they did watches at night, the young recruits would take a flashlight with them because they were scared of the hotel. I think that's very funny because it is a big, rambling, beautiful place. It's a ghost palace in a tropical setting, they wrote. There was a cartoonist named Arthur Chestnut. He would sign his name A. Chestnut for the Coast Guard magazine called The Shield, and he wrote about being a recruit. This particular cartoon is about the gas chambers. They would take the recruits and they would test and show them what it was like to be gas masked, and you would come out of there crying. So this was one of his ways of kind of poking fun at that. And he poked fun of all kinds of things. These are fabulous cartoons if you get a chance to see them. This is my friend Hib Castleberry. Hib is still kicking. He lives down in South Florida and is part of the Florida Lighthouse Association, and he emails and he visits and he climbs lighthouses to this day. He was a recruit, and he said he had orders to report to Miami in 1942. He didn't know where he was going. They said, don't bring a suitcase. The Coast Guard's going to give you everything you need. And so he goes to Miami, and they put him on 4 antique railroad cars. They hook those to the back of a scheduled train, and boom, they show up at the Ponce de Leon. And so he's very excited to see the fabulous hotel. The first thing, of course, the recruits did is hit the chow line, and then they line up to get their uniforms. And most of the time, they just handed you a uniform. It didn't have to fit. That was your job, was to trade with the guy that was more your size. So eventually you would make an exchange, and you would find one that had to fit. But Hib talked about being at the hotel, and there he is a few years ago, and there he is as a recruit, and I just love Hib's stories about it. Women joined the war effort. The female unit of the Coast Guard was called the Spars, and it was short for Semper Paratus, but of course it's also part of a ship, as you guys well know. Spars were officially formed in 1942, and they had limited duties. They couldn't be in charge of any man. They couldn't go outside the United States. They couldn't command a cutter. But in 1943, as the war kind of began to pick up, the Coast Guard realized that they needed Spars to do real things, and they made them supply officers. 10,000 women signed up between 41 and 42. And as we started doing oral histories a number of years ago, it's probably been a decade ago, with Spars and people who worked in the Coast Guard, a lot of the Spars were who was left. And so I did these oral histories, and what they talked to me about was meeting boys. They were funny. But one of the ladies is this lady right here. Her name is Marion Barnett, and she's still around in St. Augustine. And I have a lot of oral histories from Marion. The Spars were a tremendous part of the service. Jacob Lawrence was also a Coast Guard officer. Jacob Lawrence is the first African American in the Museum of Modern Art. And in 1942, he was a waiter, he was a steward's mate in the Ponce de Leon Hotel as part of the Coast Guard. And he made friends with a commander who also had an interest in art. And together they ended up getting him a fellowship. And he went all over the world painting what the Coast Guard looked like and what the war looked like. He had a unique style. This one is called Control Panel in the back. I imagine this is coasties maybe on a ship of some kind, or Navy folks or Marines getting ready to go in. His estate gave us permission to use that and talk about his work. He really went all over the world, Egypt, Italy, all kinds of places, painting what he saw. St. Augustine was really transformed. There was an officer indoctrination school that was in the Bennett Hotel. You can see the Castillo in the background if you look real carefully at the postcard. 7 hours a week studying navigation, 4 hours on seamanship, communication administration, 5 hours of drills and strategy and tactics. I don't want the Navy guys to laugh at this. This is the USS Recruit. The Coasties called it the Never Sail. They built it on dry land to train Coasties on the grounds of Flagler College. And it was fully decked out. It had its own rigging and sounding gear and a 26-foot lifeboat. and this is where they trained initially before they went to the water. There weren't very many supplies, as we'll see later on. There just weren't that many around. So there's a barracks on Marine Street, there's the gunnery range. This is actually a guy named Edward Boone who gave us this picture of the gunnery range out near the Conch Island today. And a lot of these men in St. Augustine were trained to be gunners on merchant ships plying the Atlantic. So they ended up being gunners themselves, and they trained pretty heavily for that in St. Augustine. This is from the shield up, and I thought this was funny. It was a different time. And so the blonde spar says, "What would you do if you had a man chasing you?" And the brunette spar says, "I'd stand still." It was a day when you could make that joke and people thought it was funny. So, married men were warned they couldn't bring their families to town. There wasn't a lot of housing, but some did. Married officers, some found housing. Some actually met their spouse and romances bloomed. Waves and spars wed many officers. They were officially allowed to do that in 1943. These are the families coming out of the Ponce de Leon Hotel after a visit. I met this couple when she had Alzheimer's and he was pushing around in a wheelchair, and they were in their 80s. And he was so dedicated to her. They met in St. Augustine. Here they are at the Fountain of Youth walking down in front of it. Here he is as a gunner. And somewhere here, I think it's next, I have his, Edward Bean is his name, and her name was Margaret. This is his tour of duty in the Pacific, and he left from San Diego, he went to Hawaii, he went to the Marshall Islands, he went to Guam, and he came back. And so he had quite a feat there that he accomplished, and was a remarkable man. But what I remember most is how much he loved her and how much he took care of her. And she didn't know who he was at that point, but it was pretty impressive. This is the St. Augustine Lighthouse. This is David Swain and his wife Marietta. They gave lighthouse keepers a choice. Do you want to join the Coast Guard, or do you want to stay in the keeper's uniform? And David Swain, of course, is one who very proudly picked up the uniform and wore it. The Coast Guard closed the lighthouse to visitors. There were about 10 to 30,000 visitors that would just come by the lighthouse during that time period, a year. And so they closed it to visitors. You couldn't come by, but you had to mark the ships at the top, and they had armed guards stationed in the tower. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, they built a barracks that we're restoring today at the lighthouse. And I'm so fascinated by the fact that from December 7th to when they painted it the first week of January, they built this rock-solid little building. It housed about 6 coasties. It was very small. It had plaster walls. It was built out of this wonderful pine that hasn't moved in centuries. It has the original windows and doors and handles and everything. It was really built to last. They did a tremendous job. So from that point on, people were living at the lighthouse and keeping watch all the time. And this is one of them. His name is Emery Stevens. He looks like a character to me. I've never met Emery. His neighbors pulled his photographs out of the trash where his heirs had thrown them away and brought them to us and said, "We'd like you to have these." And so he said, "We painted the lighthouse and stood guard." There was one of his little diary in there, and it had some things on it. Of course, someone had always had to be there. You had to stay here. You weren't allowed off the property. If you saw a ship, you would mark it. And you marked it on a board with a board and a string, and you measured where the ship was and its distance, and then you radioed into Government House downtown where it was. And here again, the technology with which we fought World War II just fascinates me. Here's the barracks itself, and these coasties, these are the keepers that were here. This fellow, Cardell Daniels, became head keeper. This woman, I don't know her name, but I know she married this guy here. This fellow was clinically depressed and ended up trying to jump off the tower, and Cardell had to talk him down. And here we get to the really interesting part of this. So, June 1942, we just saw the route that they were planning to take. German spies land on Ponte Vedra Beach. How many of you have heard this story? Probably everybody has. Here they are. They sunbathed, they went swimming in their swimming trunks. They buried boxes of explosives on Ponte Vedra Beach, just south of here. They were going to come back for them. Then they walk up the beach in their swim trunks to Jacksonville Beach. They go to a grocery store. One of them had a ticket for the Landrum's drugstore in his pocket when they caught him. Another account said that they went to the movies. They checked the bus schedules. They took a bus to New York City. There they met up with some colleagues, and the plan, of course, was to blow up water plants and electric plants in the United States. Except 2 of the guys got cold feet and went to the FBI. And about a couple of years ago, when they declassified that, we got Herbert Hoover's files on this, and we have them in the museum archives. And so they were able to catch them, and they sent the 2 that ratted out the others back to Germany, which probably wasn't all that great for them. And then the 4 that actually landed in St. Augustine were put to death. And they did that, they tried them and put them to death by August. They landed in June, by August they were dead. Good for them. So, beach patrol. The first Coast Beach Patrol was set up in 1942 and used jeeps, it used dogs, Dalmatians, Airedales, all kinds of animals. Horses were supplied by the U.S. Army. The World War II jeeps that were used for beach patrol had a maintenance garage at the St. Augustine Lighthouse. We've restored that today, and you can come and see it. And so beach patrol had been established before the war, but very much part of the activity of watching out for these ships. And so April 10th, same day that the Bataan Death March started in the Philippines. It's 10 p.m. in Jacksonville Beach, and there's a nice breeze, it's a lovely night. It had been 4 months since Pearl Harbor, but everybody's walking around like we're not really at war. Somebody here today was checking to see if we were at war. We're still at peace right now. And people are just not used to being at war. And so they were acting the way they always act. They were going to the beach, they had all the lights on. They were walking along. Little did they know that there's this captain offshore. Let me see if I can hit the right button here. Offshore is the Gulf Oil Corporation's newest tanker, the SS Gulf America. And she was making her maiden voyage from Port Arthur, Texas. We heard about, it was a perfect setup because we heard about oil production in Texas. And so she's going with furnace oil, over 100,000 barrels of it, to New York City. And for some reason, she decided to stop following a zigzag path. Why she did that, no one knows. I guess maybe she felt safe. And there's this fellow. His name is Reinhard Hartigan. This dude is still alive. I want you to know he's the oldest living U-boat commander. I could not find any place where he died. The fellow that I knew who knew him, Michael Gannon, died last year, so I couldn't call Michael and ask him. But that would make him 104 right now. So here he is with his periscope. And he's prowling in U-boat 123. Hartigan sank 22 ships off the United States coast, mostly tankers, some off North Carolina and South Carolina, in 2 missions. Tonight, the other thing that really defines Hartigan is he made meticulous notes, and a lot of U-boat captains did not. And so he writes in his journal, he's periscoped and he's looking at the coast, and he can see how lit up it is, and he mentions that he can see people walking along the beach. He mentions the cylinder lighthouse beyond the beach. He's talking about St. Augustine very clearly, and so he lays in wait. And here comes the Gulf America, not following a zigzag path, and it sails between the light coming from the beach. We don't know if it's a lighthouse light or another light, but he's about 2 miles offshore Jacksonville Beach, and he fires a torpedo at her. Kaboom. This is a painting by Jackson Walker Studios in the Museum of Florida Art that I think really shows it. And so there are lots of first-person accounts of what happened. There's a 10-year-old girl named Jan Swanson, and she's in the movie theater, and the blast from 2 miles offshore shakes the theater. And so she and everybody else in Jacksonville runs out to the beach to watch. That fascinates me. Seeing that everybody was coming out to the beach to watch, Hartigan actually circles back around, and he puts his U-boat in a more precarious position because he does this. He doesn't want to fire the deck guns into civilians on the beach, and he sees them gathering. He actually positions himself where the oil that's spilling out of the tanker can get him, and he's come up and he's going to finish off this boat with his deck guns. There's a corpsman named Townsend Hawks who's on the boardwalk about 100 miles from the American Red Cross station, still there in Jacksonville Beach. And they still keep a planked wooden lifeboat there. They kept a couple of them, and he finds another man. And it's usually crewed by 4 people, one of these boats. He finds another fellow. Some accounts say the other fellow was inebriated. But the 2 of them get one of these boats and they rush off to try to save survivors near the shore, which is a great act of bravery. However, they got too close to the oil and they ended up having to be rescued themselves. Robert Watson is a gunner's mate. He's part of a 7-man U.S. Navy crew, gun crew assigned to complement the tankers, which usually had 41 merchant marines. My uncle, my mom's only brother, was a merchant marine. He served in World War II at the Battle of Okinawa, actually. He was just a baby. He lied and told them he was 18. He was really only 17 to get into the Marines. But anyway, Robert Watson was asleep in the aft cabin when the torpedo hit, and his job was to get to the guns. He left his dog tags, he left $100 cash in his wallet, which is a lot of money. He ran up to the ship's deck, and the heat was so intense. It's caught on fire, the oil is spilling. He can't even get to the guns. He jumps over the side. A lot of people went right over the side into the water. And so for 6 hours he was in the water. He was suffering from hypothermia. He had petrochemical burns when they found him. He did get rescued by the Coast Guard. Carpenter's mate, Howard Grisham. He's a reserve sailor. The reserves had been set up, later became the Coast Guard Auxiliary. Attached to Mayport Naval Station, was on liberty when the torpedo exploded. He, like everybody else, rushes out to see what's going on. He's very interesting. What he does is he's in a bar. He goes back to the bar, pours himself another drink, it's empty, writes an IOU to the bartender, and then he reports for duty. Of course he does. So Grisham knew that the naval station was not prepared. He was a carpenter. He had actually retrofitted some of the ships. They had yachts that they had commandeered. They had Chris Craft, all kinds of things that they had commandeered. He had built wooden guns to make them look like they were ready. I'm not quite sure what that does for you. You know, so you look like you have a gun and it doesn't work. I don't quite get that, but there must have been something behind it. He was, so when he got there, he ended up going out in a retrofitted Chris Craft looking for survivors. They did recover some of the dead. When they got to the tanker, he was able to get a real gun, which he knew they needed, off the tanker. He ended up, however, after 7 hours of sea in the infirmary, and a lot of the guys did because they weren't ready or conditioned or prepared for this, with leg cramps and dehydration. The USS Dahlgren, and one of the things I would like to know, and maybe some of you guys can help me figure this out, is where was it exactly when it got the call to go toward this explosion? I don't know the answer to that. I would like to know. It had been on Key West on patrol right before that. She powered toward the explosion, and she dropped 6 depth charges. Now, from all the oral histories I've talked to, I think that most people thought the sub was long gone at that point, but Hartigan had seen them coming, and he had done a quick dive, and he was sitting on the bottom, and those 6 depth charges, the initial ones, crippled his sub. And he sat down there on the bottom of the sea, and here he is getting awarded later. He sat down there on the bottom of the sea, and he was paralyzed. He gave the order to destroy the machinery and the secret codes, but he said he was overcome with what he called a paralyzing fear, and he couldn't give the order to abandon ship. And so he sat there thinking he was going to die. And the men sat there. And nobody ever dropped any more depth charges. And so the sub limped back toward Germany, where he received a lot of medals. Not the good kind of medals. And he's still alive today. In 1980, he came back to Jacksonville. He was very warmly received by the citizens of Jacksonville. We're a good group of people. And he met with Michael Gannon, who from the University of Florida, and he was part of what Michael Gannon's book, Operation Drumbeat. It's out of print now, but if you ever get a chance to read Operation Drumbeat, it is a fascinating story. What he said when he came back is he sat on the beach for a long time, and I heard this from Michael Gannon himself, and he said, I should have died that night, but I didn't. And I just wonder if that will to live wasn't instilled on him that night at the bottom of the ocean. Today, the wreck is a popular fishing spot with a lot of people. About 19 men were killed, 14 of them drowned. 2 armed officers were killed in the sinking of the Gulf of America. All the survivors were rescued by the United States Coast Guard in these retrofitted craft, and these volunteers who went out from the shore. And so she didn't sink until April 16th. Dead bodies continue to wash up. Several oral histories where they're talking about people walking along the beach and finding a dead body after this, and the impression that that made on civilians in St. Augustine and in Florida. And of course, blackout conditions followed that. The St. Augustine Lighthouse was dimmed from 20,000 candle power to 5,000. And in 1947, a Coast Guard officer from Mayport arrived to collect arms and ammunition from The St. Augustine Light Station, keepers lived and worked on the property until 1955. Even today, we have an agreement. We have a quitclaim deed from the Coast Guard through the National Park Service and the General Services Administration, and there's a clause in it that says if anybody needs the light for national defense, for communication, for any reason, the Coast Guard can come back in and take it back over for that purpose. So it's still there. And so the final thing I want to do is I want to thank all of you for your service and sacrifice. Please come see us at the Lighthouse. I know that your service means my freedom. I don't want to cry. I think it's nice to hear that once in a while. So thank you very much for your service, and thank you for letting me talk today.